what is sex trafficking? How do we define sex trafficking?
Yeah.
That is a question that different kinds of people use to stop sex trafficking survivors from saying that they've been sex trafficked. So there are ways in which that's used against us that we have to be like we have to stabilize ourselves for. And I'm like, I'm not going to try to practice this by rote with the kind of neurological stuff I've got going on right now. I'm just going to write it down. I'm going to go back to it when I need it. I'm not going to worry about it. But it's a much bigger conversation than that. How we define sex trafficking is a huge part of how the sex trafficking can occur. When people don't know how to define it, that's really important.
Welcome to a City Voices interview with Max Morris, who does a lot of work helping victims of sex trafficking. Max, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
I became severely disabled as an adult in community spaces that I really believed that I was safe in. And I found out where sex trafficking pathways are operating in communities like those that I was in. And as we searched for communities who would know what we were talking about, we found out that this affects most communities. Everywhere we looked, this was going on. And so for a number of years, I and others in a network of severely disabled survivors of sex trafficking, producing public media, have been reaching out to communities and finding out where they're at on this and who is courageous enough to join the conversations that we are suggesting really need to be had.
Okay, so tell us, like, what is sex trafficking?
Sex trafficking, it gets defined in a lot of different ways. Probably the way we want to talk about it the most is sexual exploitation that occurs through force or fraud or coercion of a vulnerable individual, and financial or physical dependency created by the trafficker who benefits economically. Those who are victimized are children and adults of all ages, especially those who are intentionally disabled at intersections of hardship and orchestrated violence, and especially those who have survived previous victimizations.
Are you reading from something?
I sure am.
Okay.
I make notes because I am still very severely neurologically affected. And sometimes the questions that people ask me, well, for instance, you and I connected on Facebook. And although I've been through a lot of rehab since particular violence occurred for me related to sex trafficking on Facebook, as soon as we started talking, the last time we got on a call, and I recognized the same thing happening frequently in other cases, it activates my Facebook neurology. And so whereas I may have apprehension of the correct words in another circumstance, as soon as we've activated the Facebook neurology that has not been properly repaired yet, my mind can go all kinds of places. So I sort of noticed that happened in our previous conversation. I was like, all right, wait a second. What are the words that I know that I can use in this situation? Just in case, here they are right here.
So sex trafficking can happen. How does one fall into being victimized by a sex trafficking syndicate or what have you?
If you come into any particular intersections of hardship, there is a threshold beyond which the people around you may not believe what you're saying. They may not understand what you're saying. They may have other ideas about what it means that you're saying something. And so effectively they stop listening to you. Once you have crossed a threshold where the people around you stop listening to you, or including you in respectful discourse, there are a lot of different ways that local human trafficking operations can take advantage of you. My intersections were about severe environmental illness and toxic injury and psychiatrization that was going on in my communities, where many different kinds of situations were being automatically, I believe still are, being automatically swept into psychiatric labeling with no situational support at all, with no resource support at all, so that the people in my communities were being taken into, for instance, psychiatric hospitalization situations, and then put right back out on the street as soon as maybe a Medicaid thing or some other thing could not be milked anymore for those resources. And then they get picked up over and over again. So there's like this feedback loop. And in those situations, different roles in a trafficking network or different opportunistic individuals know how to take advantage of people who are caught in that cycle. Does that make sense?
Well, tell us about your communities and why they were so vulnerable.
My communities were already being affected by different kinds of hardship and different kinds of misinformation. And there was certainly also targeting going on from different violent factions that wanted control of different spaces. We see a lot of the same stuff happening on population levels when there is a powerful organization that wants to sell something in a particular way or wants a commodity from that area, where governments are bringing violence to indigenous communities, like that is a form of this. And it happens in a lot of ways that's very individual to a person, depending on like what tech they're using or what kinds of recreational activities they have socially.
Well, tell us about your community. Like what is it like to have grown up in your community? What was your community like? And why your community was so vulnerable?
The communities that I was in where a particular experiences of trafficking occurred, they were very compromised by the need to the need.
Well, tell us about like the socioeconomic, the racial diversity of your community. Tell us details about your community.
So there are a bunch of different communities that we're talking about, depending on how we're coming to this conversation. And the community that I'm going back to are the communities that I had in Texas. And the communities that I had in Texas, they tended to be people in hardship, but not in the greatest forms of hardship, where they were just managing to maintain jobs, where they really had a profound need to connect to healing resources, which they did not have. They had some of, but they did not really have what they needed. And so these communities are creating lots of different healing resources through whatever they're doing for recreation. And how people get drawn into certain kinds of recreation depends a lot of the time on what's being sold to them and what's being marketed to them. So on the one side, you've got people trying to keep jobs with different scientific organizations that have certain kinds of misinformation going on about, for instance, the effect of pollutants in an environment. Are the environmental pollutants really poisoning us, or is that like that's not really going on? We haven't proven that. And then on the other side, people are under such great stress that they gravitate towards different kinds of recreation. So like there are parts of the community very involved in sex parties. There are parts of the community very involved in certain kinds of video game stuff. There are parts of the community very involved in different kinds of like tech entrepreneurship, for instance. And all of these different facets have the same or different organizations that take advantage there because they can make money doing it.
What was the poverty level of your community?
Really varying. We were sitting right on top of a lot of very serious poverty, but it was very difficult to see because of how the public conversation in communities is influenced by those who would turn the conversation away from those who are most suffering. So I didn't even realize how much worse things were in my environment, because I was always kept focusing on, all right, what is needed to pay the rent next? What is needed to pay the electric next? And that was true for most of the people.
Was your community racially and ethnically diverse in Texas?
To some extent, but not as much as it should have been to properly reflect the people and the peoples who were in that area. There were Native community members, but we didn't really see Native community really represented in that area. There were Black community members, but there was a conspicuous missing component of a lot of people who, like, before I was trafficked, I did not realize, like many people in that area did not realize, that there are communities of color and communities who are intersexualized multi-generationally, from different kinds of genocide and I mean, we can say hardship, but it means a lot of things. And so our lack of awareness about who was really there in our spaces. And the reason for that is because once people had passed a certain threshold of hardship, we lose communication. And so if we're all relying on professional communication conduits and modalities that are run by organizations that are invisibilizing those people, then we don't even know that they're there. We don't even know that they're having the same hardship that then comes to us. And I didn't know where it was coming from, but, starting to notice, oh, there are poisons in these communities that are affecting everybody. And some people it has affected already. And when we trace the history of all of that, what we find are powerful multinational organizations that have long histories of targeting Native communities and stealing land, and poison.
Can you tell us, like, how old were you when the traffickers came to your town, and like, what was the point of contact with you? Was it a man, a woman, a young person? What did they say to you? How did they draw you in?
The traffickers were definitely already there. I found out that the traffickers were there because as I became severely disabled because of poisons in my environment and unaddressed compounding health conditions, which everybody was experiencing to some degree, but then some people were experiencing much more severe life-threatening versions of, and that was also me. I found out because as people began to disbelieve me when I would tell the truth or say, here is how I've been documenting my health condition, here is what professionals have said to me, here is what, here is all of these different kinds of research. I would get abandoned by people I had been close to. And then in a state of severe neurological injury, I would then try to make new friends, make new business contacts. I worked for myself. And so all of the finding social connections to not be alone as a severely disabled person, constantly having very near-death experiences over and over and over. The relationships that I was able to reach tended to be with people who already recognized the signs of that and were ready to take advantage of me. And so I went through a group of people and then another group of people and then had to say, I must not stay around these people. This is not okay. And then I would try to find another person or another group of people who I could be more safe with, and they would take advantage of me in different ways. Because once I had crossed a certain threshold of neurological injury, I could not necessarily tell very well if somebody was pretending signals about my safety or if somebody legitimately cared for my safety.
Were you looking for networking for employment? How old were you? Were you looking for a community that would support you with housing and finances, financially, etc.?
All of those things. I was in my early 30s when I'm not sure of exactly the year. It was my late 20s or my early 30s where I got very sick and we didn't know why. That went on a few years. The people around me decided that I must be lying about it. because of misinformation they had in their professional environments. Psychiatric marketing comes into that because they relied upon the marketing in those communities to make decisions about what happens when somebody is behaving in a very strange way, but they had no means of recognizing where situational solutions were needed. So the people that I ended up trying to rely on as this went on were increasingly transparent about how they could take advantage of me as regards labor or sexual availability, because the more devastated your body is, the more an operative or someone who's opportunistic just recognizes that they don't have to hide as much. And so it became very clear as I went through different people that I thought I could trust and then found out that I couldn't, that there were a lot of people who knew how to take advantage of exactly this situation. And the question as to why that could possibly be, how could that possibly go on? And I had multiple professional communities. I was doing community-oriented work, so I knew lots and lots of people. But
did they house you with other
I
victims?
understand it. Say again?
Did they house you with other victims?
I was taken from my house. So I was left alone in my house because it was said that I was actually fine. I was just lying to people about being sick. So I was left there alone when I couldn't take care of myself. And then I was taken to parties, and sometimes people would come to my house. That was primarily, so there were other people at the parties who were also in varying degrees of illness or neurological injury or just confusion or substances. How substances are used in those spaces is a whole conversation.
Where was your family at this time?
My family, so I was with my chosen family in Texas, and then was not able to trust them anymore after the way that things happened. My biological family was undergoing different kinds of hardship that had been going on for many years. My chosen family was supposedly aware of the hardship my biological family was experiencing, but they sort of said near the end there, well, someone else is going to have to deal with this. So they.
Was there anyone in your biological family that you maintained contact with through this ordeal?
We tried to, and they tried to help, and some of them made unfortunate decisions that meant I could not get help. And there's still a lot of confusion in the family about what actually happened because no one has really been equipped to talk about it. That's something that we encounter a lot through the network, is once you've been sex trafficked, people usually won't talk to you about it. So like if your family has been complicit in ways they don't realize because they had misinformation, or if your community has been complicit in ways that they don't realize, if no one will talk about it, it will keep happening. So
did the sex trafficking, did the sex traffickers involve like people in roles like pimps who would like control the transactions you had with other partners?
There was
sexual partners?
There were very loose structures about how that happened, and it seemed to primarily depend on people who were likely trafficking operatives, or just, I go back and forth because it's not terribly clear most of the time whether individuals are operating alone because they know how to work the environmental influences, or because someone's part of a network and the network is doing it. The people who were involved when I was trafficked in that way were people who seemed to be making profits by getting disabled people to take advantage of other disabled people and make it really pretty confusing about what was happening. And so for me, I was in a series of relationships with people who were my friends, but I was very severely neurologically injured.
So when you say disabilities, are you talking strictly like neurological disabilities, disabilities that aren't necessarily visible, but are certainly just as real?
Yes, but not always only. There's such a wide variety of ways that this happens. But yes, neurological injuries and brain trauma altogether, poisoning, environmental poisoning is a big subject because it causes TBI in a way that nobody can necessarily see, but then people communicate in a changed way. And if that is swept into, for instance, psychiatric labeling, that is very, very dangerous for someone with severe neurological injuries to be swept into those categorizations.
So you call it a conglomerate, right? A sex trafficking conglomerate, or a sex trafficking network that entrapped you. Did you feel, did you feel trapped, like you couldn't get out of this type of situation? And how ultimately did you get out of it?
I don't know if it was a conglomerate or if it was individuals with awareness of how to use the same tool sets as the local conglomerates, or if it was multiple conglomerates, because my experience was of being very severely neurologically disabled. And then, I mean, it's difficult for me to verbalize, but I mean, I was popped through all of this strata of impossible situations where I'm just trying to survive. And I keep thinking that I have found someone who is going to be a friend to me. And then a series of traumatic events happens, and it happens in a lot of different ways. So I don't want to say that there's any specific conglomerate in my case, but all across the network, it is very clear that conglomerates are active.
Well, why did you feel trapped? Tell us how they trapped you.
Well, if you are severely disabled enough, you can't get your own needs met. You can't get food or safe water. You can't clean yourself up. You can't get clothing. And so if a person does not have awareness around them of how those needs must be met, and the person has been severely disabled by that environment, it's like putting you in a box and locking you in. You can't necessarily move. Someone can take you wherever they want. Someone can tell you a simple little lie to gain your compliance. But you can't actually move yourself out of those situations if you are damaged past a certain threshold. And there are a lot of people experiencing that with the communities unaware of how it's happening.
How did you ultimately free yourself?
That's sort of a difficult question, because we have had to come to recognize a huge number of different layers for how this is occurring. I'm not sure that I've freed myself, in a manner of speaking, but if we're talking about being really directly taken advantage of in those ways, communicating through intuitive public radio has been crucial, because I couldn't communicate with others who understood what was going on with me. But also, what we've been documenting as a network is that these trafficking operations are active pretty much everywhere we've looked. And what that means is that I cannot interface with police or social services or a number of other of the usual mainstream support systems, because we know how trafficking pathways are embedded in those systems. And so unless there are people in a particular environment that I can know that I'm communicating clearly and effectively with, it cuts me off from a lot of things that many people would assume I would be safe with. And if, for instance, I ended up unconscious and somebody called an ambulance, I could be re-trafficked very easily, simply because there are things going on in the systems that no one has addressed. And so myself and a lot of others across the network, we're not even safe when it seems like we're safe. We're not even safe when it seems like we could regain recovery privilege, because if people assume that everything that we do in a bad situation happens with systems that we're calling for attention to what's happening in those systems, but nobody's giving that attention where it is due, it means that there are still trafficking operations that run certain spaces until somebody looks more closely at how that's occurring. I can't go to a hospital. There are a lot of government systems that I have to stay away from, because I'm aware of where co-optation is going on, and I can't trust my personal safety to those systems. There are a lot of systems like social media and tech where people put their trust in different platforms that are providing some kind of service, but because we know where trafficking activities have gone unaddressed, we can't take advantage of that either. So wherever there's this proliferation of businesses that will not address this, or organizations that will not address this, are sex trafficking survivors extracted, or are they still being sex trafficked? If I have to be on high alert all the time.
Do the sex traffickers have like actual agents in like the hospital system, the police system, the psychiatric system, where they could recapture you should you be fall into any of those systems?
Very
Yes.
common. Very, very common. Yes.
Okay, and what was it? Other survivors who helped to free you from this lifestyle?
Yes, Intuitive Public Radio was built by myself and other severely disabled survivors of sex trafficking who, previous to IPR, could not communicate at all with one another or anybody else. And it was endless hell. And maybe I'll just say it that succinctly, but because we can communicate with one another now, we are able to document things we could not document before. We're able to exchange notes about situations that we never had any hope of understanding before, because we're all operating on extremely limited brain function, but we've been building brain function by communicating with one another where we understand what's going on. And so through that, we've built a tremendous public platform with which to communicate collectively, which is much more effective than what we were having to do individually.
Are most victims of sex trafficking disabled people?
Well, I think we have to say that anybody who's being victimized by sex trafficking is being disabled, like it's happening simultaneously. It depends on how we're talking about disability. Like, I mean, we could go through a bunch of pieces of it and say, are these people disabled in the first place? And that's what makes them victimizable by sex traffickers. And I do think there's an argument for that, but I think it might be that would be a very complex conversation on its own.
Well, let me ask you, do you believe that most victims of sex trafficking have been previously seriously traumatized into people?
I think that we have so much information now about how all families in colonial contexts have been affected by trauma and violence through the generations of their families. And that's also really affecting like where people have a lot of privileges. A lot of times privileges are held in place, power structures are held in place by violence that goes on inside the family multi-generationally. And so when that's going on, anybody who's susceptible to the kinds of misinformation or mistreatment that lead to sex trafficking is already disabled in those ways. When we took the land from the native peoples and disabled them and poisoned them, that is it's a pattern that has repeated and repeated and repeated, that we have to get to the root of it and stop it in all cases in order to stop it at all in the first place. Does that make sense?
So tell us about the survivor. Does your network of survivors and really mavericks in seeking to liberate other victims, are you just looking to help people with similar disabilities who are being sex trafficked, or anyone who is sex trafficked?
We started the network to connect with anyone and everyone who was affected by those intersections and could not find help. And that's a huge list of different kinds of people. Many people are having stressors or violence in their lives that they have no idea is connected to the active trafficking networks in their location. And that's generally what we've been talking with people about. Any and every kind of person has found us and found benefit in what we're compiling, because previously no one ever heard from severely disabled survivors of sex trafficking. We didn't have a way to communicate unless somebody got lucky. But even then, when you're an individual trying to say the things that we have to say, you can get shut down really easily. People can push back on you in ways that really silence you. And if it is a network of people talking about this, it's very different. And so now, I mean, this is very recent that we are having such a different conversation because we didn't have public media privilege to do it before.
So is there a website where victims can go to find out how to connect with other survivors?
Intuitive.pub, P-U-B, as in Intuitive Public, is the main site. And we are primarily on Telegram Messenger, which is a communications aid for severe neurological disabilities. And so that's where we coordinate most of our media. There is a main channel at t.me/intuitive public radio.
So tell us more about the, I guess I would call you like freedom riders, really. I mean, tell us about the network of survivors and how successful you've been in liberating other survivors.
There are a zillion people in our network who are only referenceable as intuitive invisibles because it is not safe for them to share, a picture of them or their name or anything that would be identifying. And we've set up infrastructure that allows people to contribute privately and anonymously, in addition to if people want to build public professional platforms as themselves, then we help them do that. But so many people cannot. And previous to this infrastructure, all of our intuitive invisibles who would have participated in safeguarding communities and building what is needed were being totally cut off from that before. So we have a lot of private groups, and then we have public channels where survivors can collaborate in publishing publicly without having to reveal something of themselves necessarily. People work together and recover functions and find ways to repair what's going on in their environments. I am only able to talk to you in this way because I've gone through a huge amount of rehab that was only possible because we used those communications mechanisms and the infrastructure that we built. There are a huge number of people now working with us to compile information about what's going on in their different locations. And because it's an international network, basically every location we are compiling information. Anyone we can reach, we're compiling the information we can so that people in that location will have the benefit of recognizing survivors are already bringing these notes together, and then people can add to them. It allows us to be people, whereas we were stripped of the privilege of being treated as people. And many of us had the experience of not being people for a very long time before we were facilitated in being people again. And so this allows us to be people. And I don't know how to tell you how huge that is. What it
So
does.
you call your, the members are called intuitive invisibles. I know what invisible means, but can you explain more, like why are your members called intuitive, and combining the words, what does it really mean?
One of the meanings of intuitive for us is that we noticed that there was a lot of talk in our spaces about how important intuition is, and creativity, and listening to one's source self, and really tuning in to maybe the stillest, smallest voice of truth that is there. We noticed that there was a lot of talk about that, but when people really needed to do it for their very survival, they weren't doing it, and they weren't able to recognize survivors of violence right under their noses, where we could very easily eliminate the violence that is occurring if someone was able to listen more intuitively, with more recognition of how we all come from the same place. We all come from the same source stuff. And so intuitive invisibles are prioritizing listening intuitively, regardless of our various states of visibility or invisibility, And also, the invisible, the mystery of what is invisible. What do we learn from it? How do we learn from each other if we've been made invisible and we can't reach one another? What do we tune to? So it's a good compass.
And you mentioned the violence. Is there something more to the violence than the violence that is typical between a sex worker and her trick, where the trick gets violent? Is there something more? Is it mostly of that nature?
It is such a wide variety of different versions. I'm not sure where to start, but I'm glad to talk about more of them over time. Yes, it's like that. And it's also completely different than that. And sometimes very difficult to recognize if you don't know what to look for.
Before COVID, did the Intuitive Invisibles meet physically in person? And tell us about how the network maintains contact with its members during COVID.
We had not succeeded in relieving the traumatic isolation that was occurring before COVID was introduced. And so it was several years of figuring out where various current circumstances were connecting with the documentation that we already had in the network. And now we have recently made some progress in helping some people connect in person, but it's still really hardcore. And I even hesitate saying that because there's so much traumatic isolation across the network. We have just the very beginnings of shifts in that direction, because one of the things that we're using our network documentation to achieve is to have an international interconnecting network of food forests and resource hubs, so that people can have a way to travel, so that they have places to stop at that would support people who are severely disabled by what tends to happen at trafficking intersections. A lot of that is digestive conditions. A lot of that is having been starved or having been made very, very sick if you try to eat. And so eating, being able to reach safe food is a huge conversation. And being able to reach food that is being grown in natural and respectful ways, rather than food that has been stripped of nutrients or has been contaminated in various ways. That's a huge part of why survivors can't necessarily get to one another, or can't necessarily get to a location where they'd be safe, because the resources need to be there. And so we are in the process of establishing locational refuges, every possible location that there's someone who wants to develop a property or host in some way, so that we have the ability to travel from point A to point B to point C without encountering worse violence or hardship or accident.
And you'll have to find a trustworthy folks to provide those safe harbors, right? I mean, it could easily turn into a messy situation.
Well, that's why one of the reasons that we use Telegram so extensively is that Telegram has functions that allow us to have much more human conversations with one another, to build relationships starting on Telegram with more privacy and more security. And then once a certain amount of trust is built, then you have people collaborating in individual locations, or people finding one another, as we have started to interconnect resources from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin and the greater Midwest to Colorado. And then there are legs that go down to Texas, where I was, and out to New York. And then we're building those out from there.
Tell us what it means. Tell us about this big barrier to your work called traumatic isolation. Can you tell us, like, how would you define that?
I'm going to focus on one particular part of it that's so important. And it's that if so many people are being poisoned by everyday circumstances because businesses have relied on fraudulent and incomplete research to regulate the safety of their products, then what you have is people who will not be able to leave a space until it's certain that they won't be killed by what they come into contact with. So a lot of people are being traumatically sensitized by, for instance, water damaged buildings and toxic black mold growth. And that has been a conversation that has been really quashed in a lot of ways. But when we recognize how people are experiencing, one of the things that I experienced, for instance, is toxicant induced loss of tolerance. So that I have had to go through a very lengthy and complex rehab process to be able to come into contact with a bunch of different specific particulates. That if I would try to walk into a store, or even if I would go into like an outdoor public place where there were things being sprayed, like pesticides being sprayed or something like that, concrete dust from roads, cardboard dust or paper bags. There's all kinds of stuff that happens in warehouses. So all of there are building materials, like I could keep going. But what it means is that because people are being sensitized in these ways that stop them ultimately from doing something about it or from talking about it, we have a situation where huge numbers of people, and I would say increasingly huge numbers of people, need a conversation with their communities about how they need not be poisoned when they try to leave their living space, if they're lucky enough to have a living space. If we're talking about that, then we are dramatically decreasing the isolation that occurs, and we are dramatically decreasing the opportunities for human trafficking in those locations. So that's a big part of how we're addressing that.
So you personally were a victim of the poisoning of your environment, and that caused neurological damage. And can you tell us about your experiences going to the medical and the psychiatric establishment for help?
Sure. I'm gonna blow my nose first. So I had different kinds of health problems in my life that were sort of under everybody's radar, and I was just sort of dealing with my life in the ways that I could deal with my life. And I think lots of people can say something just like that. There came a point where my body totally crashed and didn't get better. So like I would have experiences of getting sick and then getting better. Lots of people have experiences of getting sick and then getting better. And then I had an experience of getting very sick, and then my body just didn't get better, and we didn't know why. That went on for a long time before I was able to get help interfacing with medical professionals. And when I did, most of the medical professionals that I found made it worse. And even the ones that there were a few rare ones that were really good experiences meeting them. But the really good medical professionals I found, they were so restricted in how they were permitted to do their jobs that they couldn't even be in enough contact with me to actually be advocates, even though they clearly intended to be advocates. It would be impossible to find them again after navigating the system for some time. And we found out that sort of thing is being used on purpose, but it also happens in all kinds of ways just because of the nature of those environments. The medical professionals who treated me had scripts for how they were supposed to behave if someone like me came in saying the stuff that I did. And I'm being a bit vague because it happens really differently for every person. It's really individual for each person.
So you went in there. What did you say to them? How did you seek help? What did you tell them?
This is going to be interesting. I don't really know. Where we're going to find out what comes out of my mouth. I was reading Gut and Psychology. I don't know if you're familiar with this. There's a book called The Gaps Book, Gut and Psychology Syndrome. There's a woman, I can almost remember her name. But anyway, that was one of my first entry points into finding out the effects of glyphosate on my digestion. And I didn't realize at that time that it was the Stachybotrys black mold also, but I was having all of this really strange digestive challenges, and my body could not function. My brain could not function and my body could not function. And we didn't know why. And so I brought all of this information and documentation about food things and what I had been eating and what was going on and what we decided to do about it. But really, doctors in medical professional contexts usually don't have nutritional training. And that's something that's been talked about even in the mainstream, I think, to a fair extent. That so many doctors come through their training and are neglecting themselves nutritionally, and they don't have any information about what's actually going on there. So I tended to get punted around to different professionals, and the ones who I could see, based on, what did I have? I don't know what it was exactly. I'm going to have to think about it some more. I didn't have healthcare. Well, I did have healthcare insurance. I'm going to have to think about that more. This is a bit of a murky stuff that I'm going into in my brain.
Did you ever?
Well, if I could just finish this part.
Yeah.
Well, essentially, the professionals that there was a consensus that I had most to see tended to be the professionals who were not covered by any kind of insurance. And so I could not necessarily afford to see the people who seemed to know more about what was going on. And so there was a lot of punting me around to different environments and exhausting my energy and trying to find something that wasn't requiring more money than I had to get help about it.
Was there any involvement in the psychiatric system?
Yes. And part of the involvement with the psychiatric system happened because as I continued to document what was, so there was a doctor who was really wonderful that I met with a few times, and I tried to find him again, but I didn't. And he was I think he was the only medical professional in Texas who recognized what I was saying, because he had done enough research on the gut microbiome and stuff like that to recognize like what the research that I was doing was indicating. And he praised my lists of, like, I had all of these symptom lists and documentation, like every half hour and like all of this stuff. And so he was really helpful, but then he disappeared around the same time that my chosen family was feeling really tired of us not solving this problem. And so people started pushing towards, this is a psychiatric thing. This is not, you're saying that this is about you're your body's reactions to trying to eat or illness symptoms, but we don't think it's any of that. We think it's the psychiatric stuff that has been marketed to us. And so people pushed me more and more in that direction. And I became less and less able to defend myself or advocate for myself because my body was getting weaker and weaker. And so there was a very unfortunate series of events that resulted in me being different parts coerced and forced into a psychiatric hospitalization environment where I was coerced to take medication that was dangerous for me and left on the floor lying in my own vomit for periods of time, and tried to get a hold of that one doctor because he had seen my notes and he knew what was going on, but we couldn't find him. We heard he was on vacation. I don't know about that. There was some weird stuff that went on. And so after that point, well, there's a whole lot more I can say about how psychiatrization is weaponized by trafficking operations. And we're sort of getting close to an hour, but I would gladly continue this conversation in as much detail as you're interested in. I mean, maybe not today, but.
Yeah, I don't know. So we'll put all the links for anyone who sees this video so that they can access your network, whatever links you feel comfortable sharing. Is there Do you have anything that we haven't discussed that you feel should be mentioned?
It is really easy and healing and strengthening to come close to these scary, challenging subjects and talk with one another about them and find out how we can support one another in the midst of them. It seems impossible. It seems like how we could never have enough courage to do something like that. But once you do it, once you find a way to do it, it is the source of so much nourishment you never knew existed. And it makes you a stronger being than you ever imagined being. And that's been the experience that we have from circumstances of the most horrifying, severe disability situations. We find out that there is really this powerful magic here when we restore community and we restore respectful dialogue about any and every subject. We find out that we are brave enough, and we are really inviting everybody into that.
Can you tell us an anecdotal story of how the intuitive invisibles helped someone out of a situation without, naming any names?
Every day we are organizing supplies, we are organizing any kind of dispatch. We can recognize we have a space called Intuitive Helpers, and we have a help requests channel where people can bring whatever needs come up. There is such a diverse set of different circumstances that people are in. I'm usually most comfortable talking about me. I would not be sitting here able to converse with you in this fairly normative way if it weren't for the people in the network. And yes, the people who have shown up, which has been like just, a few, not very many people have been able to show up in public, but massively the people who are coming together to help one another from the worst, most invisibly violent circumstances, the most horrible violence that you can imagine, people are finding themselves in the midst of, and they are choosing to connect with one another and believe that it is possible to do something about these situations. That's the only reason that I'm here. I would not be here if it weren't for them doing that with the infrastructure that we've built.
What are your hopes and dreams within your lifetime for victims, for the freedom fighters, for everybody?
Thriving, healthy, multi-generational families in safe, inclusive communities.
Do you think that can be done within your lifetime?
My gosh, yes. Let's go.